want to welcome everyone and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us tonight. We know that your time is precious and we will try to keep this within the time that we've allotted this evening. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Everyone is currently muted and your cameras are disabled, so please leave it that way. It distracts the speaker when we have too much activity in the background. We do have scheduled time at the end for Q&A, but you're welcome to use the chat feature to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will get to as many questions as we can. Please keep in mind we are looking for general questions only. Association specific or personal anecdotes about your community can be answered later. We will provide an email address at the end of the presentation so that you can address your specific questions at a later date. Also, please stick around after the Q&A for an opportunity to win one of 3 $50 Amazon gift cards on behalf of Cedar Management Group. If your screen name is a phone number or initials, first name only, anything like that, please update that to your full proper name so that we can enter you into the raffle. At this time, I'd like to introduce the rest of the team for this evening. As I mentioned, I'm Ashley Kearns. Nicole DeRiso is checking everyone in. Together, Nicole and I are directors of community management for Cedar, and together we oversee 8 area managers, over 60 community managers throughout the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Virginia. Finally, our guest tonight, Nick Brenneman. As the Southeast Regional Account Manager at Reserve Advisors, Nick is responsible for developing long-term client relationships and providing industry-leading reserve study consulting services. Since joining Reserve Advisors in 2010, Nick has worked with hundreds of management companies throughout the southeastern United States, ensuring that their associations receive comprehensive reserve studies, customized funding solutions, and consultative support, allowing the community leaders to understand and implement their plan for long-term financial sustainability. As an experienced educator on the topic of reserve studies, Mr. Brenneman regularly speaks at industry events and also hosts educational courses, for management companies and various CAI chapters. Nick, we welcome you. We thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ashley. Nicole, thank you. Welcome, everybody. I am so glad that you could join us tonight. Have some great information to share with you when it comes to the reserve studies, how important they are for your association. And I'm hopeful that you're going to leave here with some new information that you can take back to your community, that you can be better informed, and that it's going to make your job easier. It's going to make your community even a better place to live. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can jump right into the presentation. And I trust that you can see that. So this is called Reserve Studies, What, How, Interpret. And basically we're talking about what are reserves and how is a reserve study done, and then how do we interpret that. So in a little bit more detail, we're going to start with what are reserves, basically understanding when we're talking about reserves, what does that mean? Then we're going to talk about what is a reserve study and get into the kind of the basics there. And then the last part of this is actually my favorite part because I feel like it's almost the most useful. We're going to look at how to facilitate the study itself. So once we understand what it is, how do we as board members or as managers make sure that we're doing everything that we can do during the process so that we can get the most useful output, so that we can get the highest quality end product, so that we can make the most of our reserve study investment. And then we're going to look at how to interpret the study. So really now that we have the report, what does it all mean and how do we use it? So the reserve study is really a powerful tool, but you need to understand what it means and how to use that tool. So that's what we're going to look at for the last section. So jumping right in, what are reserves? Basically, reserves are funds that are specifically allocated for specific projects. And it could also be for a capital repair. So something that is to repair or replace a capital item or a common element maintained by the association. The idea here is that they're specifically allocated and that they're for common elements of the association. A lot of times when we talk about reserves, we make the distinction between a reserve fund and an operating fund, and the reserve being almost like your savings account. So your operating would cover your day-to-day, your month-to-month, but for those major capital in nature, capital intensive, larger magnitude types of repair and replacements that you really need to plan ahead to have some funding identified, because the operating budget just couldn't absorb that type of an expenditure. So that's what we're looking at when we talk about reserves. The first thing we need to understand is what are the components that we should be reserving for? And where we start is, well, it needs to be association maintained. So as a reserve study provider, we're coming in there and we're saying the reserve components are whatever your association maintains. This is kind of your very first starting place. And in order to figure that out, we look at a few things. First, we start with your governing docs. That's really going to give us some good information on what is the responsibility of the association. There's certainly, it's not going to have everything that we need. For something like a condo, you get a lot more detail. For HOAs, often there's not too much in there. And so if there are questions about maintenance responsibility, then we'll look at maybe get a legal opinion or an interpretation. If there's some questions, once we have a chance to look at the governing documents. And then finally, we'll look at historical practice. So what's been done historically, who has maintained that component, and maybe that's kind of just been grandfathered in that way. If that's the way you guys have always been doing it and it works, then it doesn't seem inappropriate, then we'll probably recommend that we continue to stay that way. So what is association maintained? This is kind of where we start. One thing that I like to point out is there's a difference between common and limited common components, elements, and this is important because a lot of times when it comes to reserves, I'll get an association that will say, oh, we don't need to worry about reserving for this component because it's a limited common element. And the distinction here is common is basically all portions of the condo or all of the units have access to this component. So something like a swimming pool at an HOA is a common component that everybody would have access to that's a member. Limited common being that it's limited to a certain number of members. So your balconies, for example, those are limited common because you don't want everybody up on your balconies. But that in and of itself is a usage definition. So but it doesn't necessarily refer to the maintenance responsibility. So just because it's limited common in usage, you do need to look a little bit further and find out, well, when it comes to the maintenance responsibility, where does that fall? And it can go either way. So the lesson here is just let's look beyond just the usage definition and find out if our limited common elements are actually maintained by the homeowner, or maybe it is the association's responsibility to have a hand in maintaining those, or maybe some portion of those. Apologize here, accidentally clicked off the presentation. So that's high level what are reserves. So we're going to jump into the next section here, which is what is a reserve study. And at its the first thing we need to understand, and this is kind of where I started, is the components that go into the reserve study. Because if you get this wrong, then you don't have an accurate study. Even if everything else is perfectly done and perfectly accurate, we need to make sure we have the right components in our study. So association responsibility, we put some emphasis on there at the beginning because that defines what we're reserving for. But CAI actually has a 4-part test that is part of the National Reserve Study Standards. And this is what determines a reserve component or not. And you can see just one of the 4 is that idea that it needs to be association responsibility. But the component also has to have a limited useful life expectancy. It needs to have a predictable remaining life, and it needs to be above a minimum threshold. And when we're talking about a threshold, we're talking about a cost, a repair or replacement cost, where below that threshold, it wouldn't have a material effect on the reserve funding. And this is really we don't have a CapEx plan anymore, because then we have a bunch of lines in our reserve study that don't need to be funded out of reserves, and it's not appropriate to be funding them out of reserves. So one part of the reserve study is classifying all of the components. And so the takeaway here is, just because it's association responsibility, just because it exists within the boundaries of your association, doesn't mean that it should be included in your reserve schedule, that it should be one of your reserve components. An example, maybe there's something under that minimum threshold. So sometimes I'll see a reserve study that has like the computer in the clubhouse, or like if you imagine a 1,000 home HOA with tons of amenities, and they've got like a doggy waste station or something, real small scale, maybe a bench or a piece of site furniture. These are the types of things where we want to leave those out of the study. So that threshold, it's a case by case basis. So it's not necessarily the same for all associations across the board. And we determine the appropriate threshold based on the factors that are inherent to your association. We look at your total budget and say, okay, anything below this threshold cost, it doesn't make sense to call that a reserve component, because all we're going to do by including those kinds of low dollar components is we're going to bloat the study. So now, instead of having 50 lines in our reserve study, we have 250. And now it's not a useful tool anymore. And like I said at the very beginning, we want to get our reserve study to be a useful tool for capital planning. The idea of the predictable remaining life, limited useful life, basically saying that if it's something that's going to last forever or beyond the 30 years of the reserve study, then it doesn't have a limited useful life. So something like a building foundation, we wouldn't include funding for that in the reserve study. Now, we would call that long-lived, and the long-lived components are specifically called out in the beginning of the report. And so that's part of kind of the next thing that we're going to get into, is this physical evaluation and the financial analysis. These are the two main parts of the reserve study. And they happen in that order. So you do your physical evaluation, and from all of that information that's obtained on site firsthand, we're able to determine an accurate financial analysis. So when it comes to the physical evaluation, it kind of breaks down into two parts. We've got a meeting and we have an inspection, and this is all taking place on site. And at the meeting, that's between your reserve specialist and the stakeholders. So the board members, community manager. This is on site. And what we're doing at that meeting is we're understanding the scope of responsibility. So, what is association maintained? We're talking about the history of capital projects. So we're coming in there, we're new to the community. You guys know much better than we do. We want to know what's been done, what's planned, what's upcoming when it comes to capital projects, so that it can be accurately depicted in the report. And then we want to review your budget as well. So we're looking to avoid shortfalls or double funding. We want to clearly identify a funding source for every component ahead of time, so that we're not double funding. So I use pool furniture as an example here, because some associations fund that out of their reserves, and some keep it out of their reserves and say, this is just going to be an operating funded expenditure, and we'll replace the pool furniture as needed or out of our operating budget. We can't just assume one or the other, though. So in this meeting, those are the types of conversations that we're having. And we'll say, when do you plan on funding replacement of the pool furniture from reserves? Are you currently anticipating that? Because if we don't ask and we include it in your reserve schedule, but your operating budget is prepared for that expense, then you're double funding. That's what we mean by that. And vice versa, if we just assume you're going to fund it out of operating, but you're really not planning on that, then you're going to have a shortfall because you're not going to have a funding source identified for the pool furniture. So that's one very small example, but these are the types of conversations that need to happen. And if they're not, then you're not getting a very accurate reserve study. Then you're not getting an accurate depiction of the way that things are going out there. And it's really important. So this meeting is a very integral step of the process. If you're getting a reserve study done and you don't have time to meet with your reserve advisor, then there'd be some real concerns about the quality and accuracy of that report, because it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And there is a lot of what I would call, gray area. It's not always black and white. That pool furniture, for example, it could go either way. And it's, as the professionals, we're fine recommending either one, depending on what's appropriate in that specific situation. And that's just one example. Throughout the reserve study process, you can find ways that you maybe can take a different approach when it comes to repairing or replacing, or where we're going to fund a particular component. What approach is going to be the best for your association? Well, we need to collaborate, and we need to determine what that is together. The second part of the physical evaluation is the inspection. Now, the inspection is taking place on the property. It's usually the same day as the meeting. So we'll have the meeting first thing in the morning. We call it a kickoff meeting or pre-inspection meeting. Then we'll begin the inspection. And that's where we're really going to be looking at condition and life expectancy of your components. We're looking at the manner of replacement and factors affecting the costs. So when we're on site, we're looking at everything, and we really want to determine the right components and make sure that nothing is missing, that nothing's in there that shouldn't be in there. And that's where we're looking at that 4-part test. That's where we're looking at, identifying, we're measuring, and we're quantifying everything. And then we're looking at the observable condition of your components to determine the condition, the useful life, so the remaining useful life. And then based on the remaining useful life of your particular component, well, that's how we know the timing of the repair or the replacement project that would be appropriate. So this is a very important step in getting an accurate reserve study too, because we want to base the timing of our expenditures, our repairs and our replacements, on our components condition. I don't want to know like that asphalt pavement lasts X number of years, and that's what I have in my reserve study. No, I want someone that looked at my pavement that, could report on the condition and say, based on the areas of alligator cracking in, East Bay Drive, and based on the side roads, these auxiliary streets, this is our recommendation moving forward when it comes to the roadways. And maybe it's breaking it out into some different phases. That's what we're talking about, the manner of replacement. So maybe we recommend doing the main roads sooner because they're showing more wear, and maybe those side roads that serve only a few homes, we don't need to do all of those at the same time. Or maybe it makes sense to do, to phase a project. So instead of replacing everything all at once, let's do it in a couple of different phases. That's especially helpful if you've got a community where there's components or buildings that are built at different times and different ages. We definitely want to phase those types of projects, repairs and replacements. So the timing we're getting, and we're basing that off the observable condition. And then we're also looking at the cost and determining what would be an appropriate cost. And it's more than just the unit cost times the quantity, but we're looking, like that last thing says there, is we're looking at locations, we're looking at access, we're looking at materials, disposal, really trying to get an accurate depiction of what that project would entail. So if we've got 1,000 linear feet of fence and it's in an open field and it's all right there in one spot, it's going to be a very different project cost than if it's 100 10-foot sections spread throughout the community, behind yards, etc. So it's those types of considerations that also need to go in the reserve study. So we put a lot of critical thinking, and we think about all of these considerations when it comes to what costs we're using in the report. So this is all happening on site. We're identifying the right components, leaving off things that don't meet the 4-part test, that aren't association responsibility, that are below that threshold cost. We're measuring and we're quantifying everything firsthand. So counting the number of light poles, we're measuring the square feet of asphalt pavement on your roads, getting all of that information, looking at the observable condition of each component and to determine the remaining useful life. And then once we know the timing, then we're looking at, okay, well, what is the cost going to be for that eventual repair or replacement, given the approach that we would recommend. that is all of the physical analysis. And there's a lot there. And I think it's important. I like to spend a lot of time on that because when people are talking about a reserve study, really you hire someone to do a reserve study so you can, generally speaking, so you know what you need to put in reserves. Are our reserves sufficient? I want to make sure that we have enough money in our reserves. And so tell us what I need to put into reserves. You know, that's the end game here. That's what we want to know, is that number. And that number is what we would call like your recommended reserves, or your recommended reserve contribution. And so within the financial analysis, that's really what we're providing. And we look at the fund balance. So we look at, okay, how much do you currently have in reserves? What's your starting place? And then we look at the contributions. So that's the number that we determine based on all of the physical analysis that you need to be contributing to the reserves. We look at your planned expenditures for the year, make sure those are incorporated correctly, and then the recommendations, which are the future contributions. If there's one thing that you leave here with that I think is critically important, is that the financial analysis is the output. And when it comes to what your contribution needs to be, we don't just pick a number because we like that number. And I say this because the number one call I get once an association receives their reserve study is, hey, we got the reserve study and let's talk about that contribution number. We need that to be less, or we need to change that. And that's all good and well, but it's the inputs that determined that output, and the output being that contribution. So unless we can change some of those inputs, it's going to be very difficult to impact the funding recommendations. So the lesson being that we can't back into the funding. And that's where associations get into trouble, where they say, well, you know, when it comes to reserves, we'll just put in whatever is left over. You need to take a very systematic approach and do all of your due diligence, get all that information together firsthand. Only once that is done can we really know what we need to put into reserves and make sure that it's going to be adequately funded. That's your financial analysis. A lot of people think that that's going to be the hardest part, maybe because it can be a little bit intimidating if you're not a math person, or you think about these formulas and the numbers. But it's really the easiest part, because we already got all those inputs during that physical analysis. This is just basically, okay, like, now what does that tell us? How much should we have to make sure we don't run out of money? So the next section is where we're looking at facilitating the study, which I particularly love this part, because it's good and well to understand what the reserve study is, but from my chair as a board member, as a manager, what can I do to get the best reserve study? So it's good to understand the process a little bit. So we will be requesting some items prior to the meeting. That meeting being that pre-inspection, that kickoff meeting. We'll be asking for your financial documents, current year operating budget, and a recent balance sheet. These are critical to completion of the reserve study. Why? Because we need to have that starting place. We can't tell you how much more you need to put in reserves if we don't know what's even there to begin with. That is a must. The second thing that we ask for is the declarations and bylaws. Helps us identify what is association maintained. Like I said, we review that before we even come on site, so we can really kind of hit the ground running. Then we're going to ask for some capital project information. This is to make sure that we're accurately depicting anything that's been recently completed, anything that's currently underway, or anything that is going to be coming up near term. It's very common that an association has something that they just did, that they're about to do, that's happening. And so as reserve specialists, we need to have that conversation and get that information. So if you've got a bid for a project that you just signed, we want to make sure that that's incorporated into the study, something that was just done, and so on and so forth. And then the fourth item that we ask for before the meeting is the interest rate, being the interest that you're earning on your reserves, because that will offset the funding recommendations slightly. And we use your actual interest rate to calculate that. So it's good to know these are what we're going to be asking for. If you're about to get underway with a reserve study, it's good to have this information prepared, and those are the reasons why we ask for it. How can we facilitate the meeting? So this is that discussion between the reserve specialists and the stakeholders. Well, just good to understand the meeting itself. So the duration, like I said, it's at the beginning of the day. Most inspections last a single day. For larger, more complex communities, we'll go longer than that. Go as long as needed, really. I can't overemphasize how important this meeting is. The reserve study is not done in a vacuum, and nobody knows more about your community than you do. Certainly, you know more than we do, because we're just coming in to do this. And so that's where we really get all that useful information to fine tune things, to customize and tailor fit it to your specific situation. Who should attend the meeting? We really want people there that have good historical knowledge. That's going to be a big benefit to the association, because they're going to know when something was last replaced. They're going to know the types of issues or the history of repairs with a particular component. And all of that information is great because it helps us piece together the plan moving forward by understanding what's been done in the past. And at the meeting, it's good to bring questions, bring your concerns. So the reserve specialist will be asking numerous questions, but this is also a great time for boards and managers to ask yours. So if there's something that's a specific concern, something that you want to make sure that we're made aware of, this is a great time to do that. After the meeting, the inspection, you can also help facilitate that. That's typically done independently. So the meeting, we really encourage the collaboration. But when it comes to the inspection, it's important to understand and realize that, you're hiring a independent third-party professional so that you can get objective, unbiased information. So we're really trained to do this inspection independently. And that's going to be the best for you, because then you're going to get the most accurate independent outcome, which is really why you'd be hiring a professional in the first place. Then I get the question, well, we really want to be able to walk your reserve specialist around the community. That's great. And we would certainly be encouraging that as well. So if there's a particular section of the community, or there's a particular area of concern or component of concern, absolutely. After the kickoff meeting, let's go over there, walk us over there, show us those areas, show us those components. We're more than happy to do that. But then it's really good to kind of let us go off on our own and do our independent inspection. And as you guys know, there might be that one board member that is very influential and wants to be, in control of every step of the process. This is a good time, to encourage them, let the reserve person go do their thing. That's why we're hiring them. We don't want this to be Nick's, if I was the board member, we don't want this to be Nick's recommendations. We want this to be their observations and their recommendations. So that's why we're saying here board involvement initially. We love board involvement, but then independent inspection is going to be the best for everybody. And then finally, we're looking at, okay, we know what the reserves are. We know what the reserve study is. And we even did everything that Nick said to facilitate this. So we're feeling good. We got them in the documents. We knew about the meeting ahead of time. We had everything prepared. And now we got the report back. And we have no doubt that it's as good as it could possibly be, because we attended this awesome Cedar management webinar and learned how to do everything we needed to do ahead of time. Open up this report. Where do we even begin? So let's break down the report a little bit. At its highest level, there's really 4 sections to it. We've got the executive summary, which provides a concise high-level overview of the findings, and it's easily distributed to stakeholders. So the executive summary is 1 to 2 pages typically. It's right at the beginning of the report. And the next part of this, I'll break that down into a little bit more detail, but that's usually the best place to start. And there's a lot there, as you'll see. The second part of the reserve study is your expenditure spreadsheets. And this is where you're going to get all of that detail on the quantities, on the costs, on the useful lives of each component itemized out. That's all going to be on your expenditure spreadsheets. And the third section is your funding plan. That's where we're going to see 30 years of recommended reserve contributions, how those contributions will impact your reserve balance at the end of each year, and the interest offsetting those that you're earning on those reserves, and that's all going to be found on the funding plan. And then the fourth section is your report narratives, and the report narratives is going to give you some detailed information regarding each of the common elements. That's really in there to educate and clarify. So if you get the report and you say, where do we start? I would say start at the beginning. And what I mean by that is, let's look at this executive summary. And this is often overlooked, but it's great because if you want to distribute the reserve study findings and the recommendations to the rest of the board or to your membership, it's a little overwhelming to give them the 80-page, 100-page report. But if you can give them just the executive summary, just 2 pages, and they can know almost everything they need to know, that's pretty cool. And so the executive summary will give you the funding goal, which will outline your critical expenditures. So the funding goal basically is, why are we recommending what we're recommending? Usually there's something that is driving the need for these funding levels and the timing of the contributions. And so that's going to be depicted here in your funding goal. And in this specific example, the funding goal of this reserve study is to maintain reserves above an adequate, not excessive threshold during 1 or more years of significant expenditures. And our recommended funding plan recognizes this threshold funding year in 2026 due to replacement of the asphalt pavement. So what does that mean? That basically means that there's 1 or more major projects that are driving the funding, and there's a reason why we're building up our reserves as they're depicted here. And in this particular case, that major project is going to occur in 2026, and it's the replacement of the asphalt pavement. So everything that we're recommending is basically to prepare for this one major project. That the year that major project happens, or the years that those major projects happen, are what we call threshold years or critical years. And a critical year or threshold year is just the year that your reserves get the lowest, years of major expenditures. Because some years, we're doing a 30-year plan, and some years you won't have a lot of expenditures, and other years you'll have some major expenditures. And it just really depends on the age of those components and your specific situation. So that's your funding goal. So we're already understanding that, okay, there's some major project coming up. It's going to be, in this case, it's the pavement, and it's happening in 2026. It also says that we want to maintain reserves above an adequate but not excessive threshold, which is important because this whole thing is about adequate reserves. The goal is not to just keep building up our reserves. You can overfund your reserves. You can have excessive reserves that, frankly, you're just asking the membership for money that you don't really need. So we want adequate but not excessive reserves. Then the next part of the executive summary is project prioritization. So now we have the luxury of a 30,000-foot aerial view, high-level overview, because we've got every project in the next 30 years, the timing and the costs and the funding for that. Knowing that, what can we do now, or what projects need to be done now? And this is going to be really helpful because I'm sure you've been in those meetings where nobody really knows what is the right move next. So if we have some money, what should we spend it on? Without this information, we don't want to make the wrong decision and then have it come back to bite us. So it's really nice to have this professional, independent report laid out and then say, okay, now let's look at the next 5 years. Look, we've got to do paint finishes to the stucco. We need to do a partial sealant replacement, and we need to replace the roofs, because if we defer that, it could lead to further water infiltration. So if we have this, then we can say, okay, so those lights at the tennis courts, or that rusty gate, those things might have to wait. So this idea of maybe, what is more critical, what needs to be done as a higher priority, that's going to be right here in your executive summary. So you can say, okay, in the next 5 years, these are some of the bigger projects that we need to do near term. And then we look at the recommended reserve funding. And this is another section in the executive summary, but basically this is where we talk through, okay, where do we need to be? And then this is kind of how are we going to get there? And it's just kind of written out, in paragraph form or in bulleted points. It's not, it's not just numbers, but anyone can read this and say, okay, phased increases in our reserve contributions of approximately $3,500 from 2020 through 2024, and then inflationary increases through 2049. And the initial adjustment of our reserves of the $3,500 is about a 1% adjustment in our total operating budget. It is equivalent to an average monthly increase of $3.89 per unit owner. This is basically saying that if we follow these recommendations, which actually end up being only $3.89 per unit owner of an increase, when we need to do, back to that funding goal, when we need to do our pavement in 2026, we're going to have enough money. We're going to have adequate reserves. So the next section is the expenditure spreadsheets. And that's where we really want to look at, the itemization of each common element. Like I said, your useful lives, your remaining useful lives, project timing and costs. So, okay, the executive summary was nice. I saw that thing about the asphalt streets. I saw that thing about the sealants. I want to know a little bit more about that. So that's where we're going to pull up the expenditure spreadsheets. And I can show you here kind of the lay of the land. So basically, each row is one of our reserve components, and they're grouped by category. So you've got your exterior building elements, interior building elements. Often there's a category for site components. And here we're seeing the actual component. We're seeing the quantities and the unit that it was measured in. We're seeing the estimated first year of the event. So that's basically saying, when is the first repair or replacement? When is the first time we have an expenditure related to that component? Then we see our useful lives here in the life analysis, and we're seeing useful life and remaining useful life. Useful life is that component, generally speaking, this is how long it will last. So, for your asphalt roofs, we're saying, okay, asphalt shingle roofs last 15 to 20 years. And remaining useful life, that's the observable condition of your components. That's saying, but your asphalt shingle roofs, based on what we've seen, based on the age, they're going to last 4 to 5 years. That's your remaining useful life. So you're going to have both of those there. Then you're going to have your unit costs. If it's broken out, if it's a phased project, you'll have the cost per phase. And then you're going to have each year, you see a number. That's basically when an expenditure. That's when you need to spend money on that component in that year. So, let's just take this 73,000, for example. When is that happening? 2024. What is that for? The flat roofs. And it's a phased project. So it looks like we're doing that half in 2023 and the other half in 2024. That's the expenditure spreadsheet. So you can see there's a lot here. In the explanatory notes, this says that 2.5 is the estimated inflation rate. So these expenditure tables do have an inflationary factor, which is super important now more than ever, because we want to make sure that we're preparing for those future expenditures appropriately. That's the expenditure spreadsheet. And you can see why it's nice to start with the executive summary, because if you just send this out to the membership, it can be a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot there. But once you understand the lay of the land, you can see really what the information is that we're trying to convey. Now, at the bottom of each of these year columns, we total up all the expenditures per year. So we take this, I don't think you can see my pointer anymore, but we would take this 38,400, we'd take this 12,800. We would total all these expenditures up per year, and those would be at the bottom of this table, and it would say, total expenditures per year. And that's important for the next section, which is going to be our funding analysis or the funding plan. I think I can keep the laser in advance. Yep. So the funding plan is going to detail our contributions and our expenses by year, highlight the critical years, which if we remember from our executive summary, critical years is when our reserve gets the lowest. So that's going to be our year of major expenditures. That's going to be highlighted in our funding plan, and it's going to give content regarding the funding needs. So this is our funding plan. And again, let me break it down for you. There's a lot here, but it's very logically laid out. Again, the years are the columns, and each row now is a different value. And so the first row, I'll go down here with you. The first row is our reserves at the beginning of the year. So the first year of the study, this is what you've got in reserves at the beginning of the year. That's your starting place. The second is the recommended reserve contributions. That's the number that the reserve advisor came up with based on all of those inputs. This is what is the appropriate contribution so that you never run out of money, you're adequately funded, and you're not overfunding your reserves. Then the third line is the interest earned. As I mentioned, we offsets the funding a little bit. So this is the interest that you're earning. And then the expenditures that year are deducted here. And that's what I was talking about on the expenditures, how we have that bottom total expenditures each year. That's where we get these from. So the 51, the 52, the 57, those come right from the expenditure spreadsheet, which are all of those inputs. And so that's why the expenditures really drive the funding, because they're right here. They're part of that calculation. And so the way the math works is, let's take 2020, for example. Our starting balance is 565, 448, and then we're adding the 95.5 because that's what we need to add to our reserves. We're also adding the interest because that's a positive flow of cash. And then we're subtracting the expenditures and to get our year-end reserve balance. In this case, it's 616,000 and change. And then our year-end in that year becomes our starting reserve balance the following year. And then we have a contribution, the interest again, those expenditures from our previous table to get our year-end balance again. And then it's pretty much just rinse and repeat. And that's how that works. One thing that this illustrates is this predicted reserves based on the current funding level. This shows that if you keep doing what you're doing, in 2026, you have a deficit of $34,000. You're out of money. So this is why you need to start making these adjustments now. You have time. And remember, it was just a slight increase per unit owner. And by just being diligent about those contributions, figuring it out ahead of time, 2026 becomes a cash positive year where we can do our payment and we still have 64,000 left in our reserves. Note 5 means that this is our threshold year. This is our critical year. See, look at our year-end balance in the previous years. Look at how much we have left in our reserves. We got a lot of money. We got over $700,000 in reserves at the end of 2022. And then you look at 2026 and we only have 64,000, and you would say, whoa, that's not right. Well, that's how the funding plan is designed. We're supposed to have a clearly defined critical year, because if we don't, then we're overfunding our reserves. Then what is that money doing in reserves if we don't need it? Now, we don't want to be too lean, and that's why we call it a threshold funding year, because this is a threshold funding model, which means that even in that critical year, we still remain above some sort of a predetermined threshold. If we wanted to take the most aggressive approach, that would be what they call baseline funding. Baseline funding methodology, instead of a threshold in your critical year, you just stay above zero in your critical year. That's called baseline funding. So even if you have $1 left in reserves, that would be baseline funding. This is threshold funding. That's what we always recommend, because it gives you that cushion. It gives you that, a little bit of breathing room, if you will. The other thing that you'll see here is that we also have the interest rate that you're earning on your reserves clearly depicted as well. And these are inflated as well. So that inflationary factor that we used on the expenditures, we also use on the funding plan. This is my favorite part, because this really tells the story. You can look at the tables and I can walk you through, show you the lay of the land, but this tells the story of everything that we just talked about. And what you see here is the three parts of this graph are the expenditures. So the red bars going down are your expenditures each year. And then you have your reserve balance at the end. So this is your year-end reserve balance, this blue line. And then you have your reserve contributions, which are these green bars. And so what you see here is basically the strategic funding plan, that threshold funding plan that we just walked through. But here it is in an illustrated, in a graphic form. And like I said, this shows us everything that we were talking about. So expenditure wise, yes, some years we don't really have too many expenditures. You know, look, 2040, we don't even really have anything at all. But there are other years, 2046, you know, where we have some major projects. So that's why if we just kind of take this wait until something needs to be done approach, we're really going to get into trouble because the expenditures are so sporadic, but we really need to have this high level, you know, overview and plan ahead to be prepared. The other thing that this illustrates nicely is that we're not overfunding our reserves. What you don't see here is this reserve balance just going up and up and up and up and up. That's not the goal with funding our reserves. The goal with funding the reserves is just to be adequately funded and to kind of balance we call this a cash flow funding plan, because it's basically balancing the cash out and the cash in and making sure that the money is there when we need it. And then the final thing, which I think really is the takeaway here, is even though we have these, you know, uneven expenditures in our reserve balance, some years we have a lot left in the bank, and other years, like our critical year, it gets very low. Our contributions are relatively stable. And the increase that you're seeing here is really just an inflationary increase. So we need to, you know, make sure that we're preparing our plan for that. But so this is how it was designed to work. This is, you know, you're prepared for all of your capital events, all of the eventualities. It's based on, you know, an independent inspection and with a relatively minor increase, and you have the luxury of time. So, you know, you've got time until this major project out here. And so if we start now, you can see we can build up our reserves so that by the time that project hits, we have enough money left at the end. If you wait and let's say you get here and you don't have any money in reserves, then this is going to be one giant contribution, what we call a special assessment. That is a dirty word in the industry because of the pain. I mean, if an owner needs to put up that much money all in one shot, in one lump sum, it is a board that is not fulfilling their fiduciary duty. It is, this isn't unpredictable. You know, we're not talking about an act of God that is unpredictable here. We're talking about your inevitable day-to-day deterioration. We know nothing lasts forever. You know, some people think reserves are for the future. You know, I don't need to worry about that. I'm not going to be here when that needs to be replaced. Reserves are for your daily ongoing depreciation. The expense might happen in the future, but we're collecting that money now. So you can see here, special assessment thing, it's like Russian roulette. It's like dodging a bullet. Like if I move in right before the project happens, then I'm paying for whoever lived there before me. And they use that the whole life of that component, whether it's my roof on my townhome or those private streets. It's not equitable. It's not fair. And a lot of times it's a burden that the owners can't manage. Here, what you see is this is equitable. Doesn't matter when you moved in or when you moved out. Everyone is paying their fair share, and the association is in a position that's going to keep them in a financial health and well-being and financially sustainable. So reserves are the way to go. There's really four options. I'll close with this. There's four options when it comes to funding a capital project. You could fund it out of your reserves, where, as you see, you're earning interest on that money too. So it's actually the most inexpensive way of funding any capital project, and it's equitable, like I just discussed. You could get a loan. Okay, so let's not prepare our reserves properly. Let's wait, and then we'll take out a loan. We'll get, the association can borrow some money. Well, to get a loan, you need to pay to borrow the money, and also you have to be approved. There's certain criteria that you need to meet for the lender to give the association the loan. And believe it or not, one of the biggest criteria that the lenders are asking for, I'm close with a lot of association lenders, is the reserves. They want to see, well, how healthy are your reserves? What does your reserve study look like? Some of them are even asking for a reserve study. So the idea that you can just put all your eggs in that basket and completely ignore your reserve responsibilities is a falsehood. The other thing, the third option, is a special assessment, which we talked about. It's not equitable. Sometimes it's unmanageable. You think about people that are on a fixed income or something, they can't handle a burden like that and pay all of that all at once. And then the fourth option is to do nothing. And there's a lot of associations, unfortunately, that are really good at the fourth option. And all they're doing is delaying the inevitable. And as a board, we need to be better than that, because we have a fiduciary duty to the association to preserve and protect the value of the units. And part of that is making sure that we're going to be in a position that's financially sustainable. So the other three are all way more expensive and painful than just funding the reserves. Now, I do recognize that if you've never funded reserves before, if you've never had a reserve study before, it's not a walk in the park to go from where you're at to, living in a plan like this. It's going to be challenging. This is a touchy topic. Anytime you're asking people, to put more money into their assessments or increase the contributions, you're not going to be the most popular person right away, but it comes down to education, really. And that as a board, this is our duty, and that we're protecting you, and that it's for the greater good. It's sales. I mean, you have to sell this to the membership. So get a good reserve study partner. I have these conversations all the time with boards. I hop into a telemeeting or a Zoom or go to a board meeting and help the board, help the membership, prepare them to have these conversations. Because I get this isn't happening in a vacuum. And all of this sounds really good in theory, but I know you're thinking like, Nick, if you only knew my community, like this would never work. Yeah, it's going to take some work to change that mindset and to change the culture. But we just have to keep at it. Transparency, open dialogue, and it's not the easiest thing to do. It's not, and I can agree with you on that. But it's the right thing to do. This is how it's been designed to work, and it's more important than ever right now, because nationwide there's a spotlight on reserves. There's things happening in other states where reserve studies are being required. Not only that, but you're being required to adhere to the funding in those reserve studies. And while North Carolina doesn't have anything like that in place, I can tell you that the Community Association Institute, the chapter here, is keeping a close eye on what else is happening in other states. And so reserves is not something that's going to go away and that you can just keep ignoring. In fact, it's going to get even more and more of an emphasis and more important moving forward. So no time like the present to have a good understanding of this and start to use this tool to your advantage. Like I said, a reserve study is a very powerful tool, but it's often a missed opportunity. And then the fourth part is the narratives, and this is the bulk of the report, where you'll find a lot of pictures and schematics that kind of depict the specifics of those components. This is good when it comes time to do these projects. The board can be more informed and get some additional information here. But like I said, this is kind of the last place I would go, or the last thing I would share. Start with the executive summary and kind of work your way through. This is really helpful information, but it can be overwhelming if you try and look at it all at once. But there's definitely a time and a place where this provides great value as well. So that's everything I wanted to cover. I'm happy to answer questions as well. Ashley, I'll kind of let you take it from here.
We had a lot of questions happening as you were speaking. Can you just touch on a few, because we are limited in time? Brian Engel asks, considering the recent inflation rates, what is recommended in a reserve study now to accommodate for those rates in the future?
That's a super question. So there was always a best practice to get your reserve study updated around every 3 years, even in like a stable economy, because the reserve study is a snapshot in time and all of those inputs can change, and they do change. When it comes to inflation, we certainly want to make sure that we have an accurate inflationary assumption. Since it is a 30-year plan, we're not going to use double-digit inflation because we're optimistic that it's not going to be 30 years of double-digit inflation. But we do want to use something that's more appropriate. I believe we're using somewhere around 3.5% right now. But the impact here is that because the inflation and also the costs, like after COVID, we saw all of the material costs and all those supply chain issues driving that the reserve studies are getting outdated quicker, and the deviation from reality is even greater than it's ever been before because the swings are so wide. So make sure that you're getting these studies updated. Every 3 years used to be sufficient. You may even need to start doing them, sooner if things stay as unstable and unsteady as they've been. But inflation is really important. We're always kind of taking a look at the economic indicators and our leadership team to determine what would be appropriate. But I believe we're using somewhere around the neighborhood of 3.5%. And we can always have a conversation about that, during the kickoff meeting too, to make sure that everybody's comfortable with the assumption in the report.
Right. Excellent. So that takes me to a question from Rico, who asks, do we have to do a 30-year, I'm paraphrasing, a 30-year? Can we not do a 5 to 10 year? And I mean, is that a possibility because of the changes in the world?
That's a good question. So 30 years seems to be like an industry standard. And I think that part of the value of the reserve study is that long-term horizon. So you can pull out the near-term years, but to prepare for what's coming down the road, it's going to make the biggest impact by having that 30-year window. We typically don't do studies less than 30 years. I think maybe some providers do a 20-year study, but in order to fulfill the objective of the reserve study, it's a long-term plan. So I would recommend keeping it a long-term horizon just because of everything that you're able to accomplish here. Otherwise, you're kind of limiting the usefulness of it if you don't look far enough out.
Okay, that's a good parlay into just kind of a general question from Mary. Can you summarize what is the actual importance of a reserve study? I know this whole thing was kind of talking about what one is and what one can help with. Would you speak on the importance of it?
So the reserve study is the only way to know how much you need to have in your reserves. If you don't go through that process, then you're pretty much just speculating. And it's the board's fiduciary duty to undertake that responsibility and to make sure that you have adequately funded reserves. So it's going to give you what the contribution needs to be. It's going to help you fulfill your fiduciary duty. You're going to have the money that you need when you need it. So the community is going to be a nicer place to live. It's going to be, higher quality. Things are going to be functioning, and it's going to maintain the value of the units, the value of the homes. The objective, independent, third-party reserve study is a very effective tool for the board because everything that we do as a board is always called into question. There's always people that doubt, that question where the information came from, that question the motives, that question this, question that. And so the reserve study allowed the board to say, this is the plan, this is what needs to be done. And it's, like I said, it's not Nick's plan, it's not Bill's plan. This is an objective third-party tool that's going to give us the preparation that we need to be financially healthy. So that's really what the reserve study accomplishes. If you're not getting a professional reserve study, at a minimum, you should go through the same types of steps that are outlined in the reserve study process because that information is going to be needed. Otherwise, you're just kind of putting out fires as they come up. And that's going to make your life more difficult than it needs to be. Those board meetings where you spend the whole meeting talking about what we should spend this money on, or how much money we should be having. When if you had a reserve study, you could just open it up and you'd know exactly what the answer is, and then you could move on to the next thing.
Excellent. So we have one more question. We actually have a lot of questions, but one more that was kind of repeated throughout, and I know the answer already. I'll let you speak on it. What is the cost of a reserve study for an HOA?
Super question. So it is a case-by-case basis. So the cost of your reserve study will depend on your community, really the size, the complexity, the amenities, the age. Older studies take more time because more things fall into that 30-year window. Generally speaking, I'd say most reserve studies that we do for like your average community association are probably between $3,000 and $5,000. Very, very small communities could be less, more complex could be more, but generally speaking, that's probably a good range if you're preparing budgetarily, 3 to 5. And you can go to our website, and there's a button that says, reserveadvisors.com, request a proposal. And it basically just submit some basic information about your community, and then we can put together a cost for you. There's no cost to do that, and we can tell you exactly what the reserve study would cost.
Right. And so in keeping with that same question, as it has to be renewed or reviewed, I should say, every 3 to 5 years, is that cost less than the initial, which you can speak on?
Sure. Yes, it does. So you only really ever need to do the first reserve study, which they call a level 1 or a full reserve study, one time. After that, it is going to be either a level 2 or a level 3, which is an update without a site visit or an update with a site visit. Either of those updates are going to take less time than the first time study. Less time means it's going to come at a lower cost than that first time study. So it's good to stick with the same partner. Some firms won't update another provider's study, and unless they get that information firsthand, they're going to have to start with the level 1. There maybe are firms out there that update any study. As a rule, we only update our own studies. So if you did a study with another firm and then came to us, because we don't have confidence in those measurements and those quantities. So if we're going to put our name on something, we're going to get all of those inputs ourselves firsthand. But for associations that partner with us on a repeated basis, those future studies are either, updates or updates with or without site visits. Those are going to cost less than the first time study.
All right, excellent. So any questions that did not get answered tonight, and there were a lot, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone. Nick's email address is on the screen right now. But because we are out of time, I'd like to go ahead and announce our raffle winners. And congratulations to Daniel Mateague, Denise Bartlett, and Tabitha Castle. You are all recipients of a $50 Amazon gift card. We thank everyone for joining us tonight. We thank Nick Brenneman and Reserve Advisors for participating in this, and we hope that everybody got a lot of good information. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Send me your questions. I'd be happy to answer them